Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of November 16th, 2020. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, though broadcasting from the home office yet again. I'm joined this week by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project, also at the home outpost.
Yes, as always.
Safe and sound. So today, as we navigate in the strange interim period in Texas politics between the election and the convening of the 87th Texas legislature in January, one of the stories that's getting a lot of attention in the Texas political world right now brings us back to the internal politics of the Texas Republican Party and the wrinkle that the newish but pretty new Republican Party of Texas chair Allen West, not of Texas, has played since his election during at the Republican Party convention this summer. There's a big story in the Texas Tribune this morning, and we should also know, I think Ross Ramsey wrote a column about this last week or the week before that was also very good and interesting on this. But we'll go with Patrick Svitek's story for the opening salvo, and I was going to put together a list of how Allen West has gained attention since becoming chair, but we'll go with Patrick's language. And Patrick writes, in his first few months as Texas GOP chairman, Allen West has sued fellow Republican Governor Greg Abbott for extending the early voting period due to the coronavirus, protested outside the governor's mansion over pandemic-related shutdowns, there's a common thread there, and assailed the likely next state House Speaker, also another member of West's own party, as a traitor, and he could have said, quote, unquote, a traitor. Too many quotes inside Patrick's quote there. So, you kind of get the picture from that. Since being elected party chair, a role that is typically, as his opponents have pointed out repeatedly, about helping Republican candidates and kind of tending to the store as the chair of the party, West has actually been more likely to cultivate conflict and aggravate pre-existing conflicts than he has been to rally the troops. Now, to be fair, Allen West says that he was going around raising money just like other Republicans, and
he said he was in South
deserves
Texas.
some credit in the last election, etc. Nonetheless, the more divisive activities have gotten the most attention. And as we were talking before we started, that doesn't seem to be by accident, to understate the case, right? And this is part of the critique of a lot of his opponents right now, right?
Right. That's right. So West came in, he's a one-term congressman from Florida, and he moved to Texas, almost seemingly to run for the GOP chairman position. I don't know what his other motivations were, but this seems to be the thing that he talked about, in the lead up to this election, if you will, and the elections amongst, delegations from each of the state Senate districts. And so he had ran earlier in the year, I believe, against James Dickey, who was the former party chairman. And the basic, argument that West was making was that, essentially either Dickey was too beholden to the establishment interests in the party, or that he had become too beholden to the establishment interests, and that he would basically, retake the mantle of the grassroots and the activist wing of the party and make sure, not to sort of sit back if he felt like the party wasn't, behaving appropriately. And he's certainly done that. So that was sort of this, that was where he started all this. And the question now is sort of, so what to make of all of this? And I think, you and I are both a little reluctant to even talk about it in some ways, because, I think for Allen West to be getting all of the attention, really for the Republican Party of Texas chairman to be getting this kind of attention is certainly by design. He clearly wants this attention. I mean, he's going out and he's made efforts. One of the first things he did as I think being elected chairman was he challenged Texas Democratic Party chairman to a series of debates leading up to the election, which he immediately refused. Not because, and I don't know what his motives were, but the kind of obvious of this is like, hey, the candidates are supposed to be running and we work for the parties. This is like a different sort of thing, but it gave a sense of the way that West wanted to approach the job, I think, from go. So here we are now, and we're seeing these divisions. There's a lot of things we could make out of this. What are the things that you're making out of it, I guess?
Well, I think there's an interesting dimension in here. There's kind of, as you mentioned, I was reluctant to some degree to use him as the hook for this discussion, to overly talk about him, because it feels like just basically acquiescing to his media strategy,
right.
Which has been thus far fairly successful, in the sense that, say whatever you want about James Dickey from either an external or an internal perspective. You never really got the impression that he saw the job as a vehicle for his own self-promotion. And I say that, look, did he think he got something out of it like everybody thinks they get something out of most things they do to some degree? Yeah, sure. But, you never got the impression that James Dickey was out trying to make headlines. And as you say, this seems to be part of what Allen West is trying to do here. What do I make of it? I think that, it invites attention to something that we've talked about for years and a lot, and deservedly so, which is, just what is the ideological kind of nature of the Republican Party of Texas? What are we really talking about here? And what do we make ideologically of the internal conflicts that sometimes seem to be factional conflicts with only minute overall distinctions in overall ideology and where you would put people on a spectrum? And I think if you look at the narrow band of some of the more quantitative, looks at this, you kind of see that. And also just what other axes of conflict are going on inside the Republican Party. As simple as, ins and outs. And that's not to say that there aren't ideological distinctions, but, these things become so personalistic and so factionalized that it creates the raw material for the kind of political entrepreneurship that you see here. So, the first thing I make of this, to step back from all of that gobbledygook, is, I flagged this in the mailing we did last week to the people that to our email list. And if you're not on the email list and you're hearing that, if you go to our website, there are multiple places to sign up. There's a place on the blog post, or you can just email us at Texas Politics. What is the .laits.utexas.edu, I believe, or or just find one of us on, just email us. Yeah, just find one of us and we'll add you to the list. But there was a story in the Tribune last week on Allen West being opposed and saying that Dade Phelan, the Speaker apparent of the Texas House, was, as we said, a quote unquote traitor. That very drolly, in a kind of just declarative sentence, said, the chairman of the Republican Party does not get a vote on the Speaker of the House. And I think as we move into legislative mode, I think we can expect a certain amount of pushback against Allen West should he continue to take this tact during a legislative session. Now, he will have ideological allies in the party, that will be, to my mind, the usual suspects that will support that. But for the most part, it will be interesting to see whether, and I don't want to steal your line and you can develop this, but the idea that, I was talking to some other observers of politics this morning about Donald Trump, and this will be relevant, in which, one of the things that's really notable about Donald Trump, I think, is his ability to look at some of, the basic features of self-interested politics and then extrapolate them to some extreme application or to some extreme point that other people are sometimes inhibited from extrapolating. In other words, if I'm expected to be self-interested, I'm just going to be self-interested and publicly so to an unbelievable extent. And I think there is a little bit of that going on with Allen West here, where he's testing the limits of that melding of highly personalistic, self-interested politics with a Republican Party that now seems opened up to that in some ways by Donald Trump, as long as you do that in the name of conservative purity.
Whatever that means.
Whatever that, well, I mean, what you do is, I think, what that means is I think point well taken what that means, but I think
it's one of the.
Well, what's interesting about it is it's leveraging that personalism and that personal power to define that through agenda control, and we've seen that in the recent past. Look, the problem is that it has a shelf life, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum.
I mean, do you think this is really about agenda control, or do you think this is about? I don't want to say Allen West's ambitions, because that's not really, again, I think that's in some ways,
no, I think that's
limiting
fair
this
enough.
discussion. It's fair, but I think it's actually limiting the discussion a bit too much. The sort of discussion of self-interest taken to its extreme obviously goes back to his self-interest. But I also think, as you were kind of going through the list about the idea of staying in one's lane, and the idea that, Allen West, GOP chairman of Texas, is saying, hey, House members, you're traitors if you vote this way. And, the idea that he's going to the governor of Texas, certainly a conservative, and certainly, a pretty, well thought of conservative and amongst conservatives, and saying, hey, you're a traitor if you close down the economy. And it's kind of like, and there is something obviously in all this, which is sort of like, and I kind of mentioned at the beginning how the GOP chairman gets elected, but it's sort of like, this is the Republican who's been elected by the fewest people of any Republican that he is telling what to do. And I think there's something about that stylistically, again, outside of self-interest, that in and of itself is sort of an interesting, circa 2020 kind of piece to all this. Let me ask you another question that I think is related to this too, though, which is, I was thinking about the disbandment of the Empower Texans, was their political action committee recently, right? And and this is something, there's sort of a right now element to this Allen West thing we could look at. There's sort of a historical long-term thing that you had alluded to, I believe, in the gobbledygook portion of the discussion, as you called it, right? Which is, this idea that there's been this axis of tension within the Republican Party between the activists, who we could, classify any number of ways, but I think for them, maybe the most important way is to say the group of people who regularly show up in Republican primaries, or the group of people who regularly make up a majority of the people who show up in Republican primaries, whether statewide or in legislative districts. And the extent to which, the party as a whole was reflecting the most activist elements, basically of their party. And for, at least, I've been watching this now for like a decade. For a number of years, it was basically a lot of the angling and positioning, especially in legislative politics, but statewide politics, was around this concern about, not being seen as sufficiently worthy amongst this group of voters. 2018 happened, the elections were much, much closer. All of a sudden you had Republican elected officials say, we're focusing on public education, property taxes, big issues you care about. We're not trying to get bogged down in stuff that's going to make a lot of, bad will in the legislature, the sort of things that we focus on. And we move on, and then you get here. And I think what's interesting to me on the Allen West piece of this and sort of his movement, both before the election and after, is, we're kind of in the period right now where everybody's trying to interpret the election results. And I don't mean that as like a fair interpretation. There's plenty of people trying to fairly interpret what happened, but there's a lot of interpretation going on by interested parties. And at the national level, you could say Donald Trump is interpreting the election as one that he won and that is still a dispute. And that's, again, interpretation of the election actually probably hurts Republicans in the long run, not to look at it and say like, hey, we keep losing the popular vote by a lot, and, we should evaluate that kind of thing, right? Biden is interpreting the election as decided and that he's moving forward. And then you're here in Texas, and I'm kind of still wondering right now, like, okay, Republicans, everything kind of stayed more or less the same, but within a trajectory of a more competitive political environment. So the question I kind of have going forward, and the Allen West thing I think really, points to this is like, so what happens now? Do we see a legislative session in which, Republicans, I think having held their ground and knowing that they're going to get to do redistricting, sort of push ahead towards more of, what we'll call the formally, whatever you want to call it, the movement conservative wing, or the activist wing, or whatever, is there more about making sure that they take care of those people? And those are really the people that, I think Allen West is trying to speak for? Or do they look at the election and say, hey, number one, we're going to have a really tough session. Well, actually, the tough session actually maybe would make it easier to do more conservative, like social issue type things. But let's see, do they say, should we stay on the trajectory we were in 2019 and 2021, or are we going to snap back to more of like a 2017, 2015 style session? And what I think is interesting is, to the extent that I think, Donald Trump has become such a force in this, number one, the extent to which Republicans, were much more serious about appealing, I think, to independent and moderate voters in 2020 after 2018. It seems to me that West is trying to fill a spot. It seems like he's trying to fill a position that may or may not exist here, in the electorate, but he's doing a pretty effective job. But I wonder, at this point, and we kind of go back to this and I'll pass it back to you, but how much is this even about ideology? I mean, in the sense of, what strikes me most about West in some ways is how personalistic his approach to this job already is, even though he's actually working as technically, for the party, right? I mean, he's supposedly trying to, advance the interests of the party, but the individual approach to it and the sort of, I don't care what lane I'm in, I don't care who I'm telling what they should or shouldn't be doing. I'm looking for conflict. I'm looking for headlines. It feels very familiar. And I think, the discussion we might be having right now in a normal election cycle would be like, so where does the Republican Party go next, right after losing the national popular vote again and losing the presidency after one term, would be the question. And I'm trying to figure out how I vector, sort of West into all this, even though I don't think that in the long run he's necessarily an important player in this discussion. But he's an interesting example of the moment that we're in right now, I think.
I would go back to what I thought was the question about the agenda and say, well, the two things. One, I think the question of, agenda control is less, to my mind, about, from West's perspective, probably anyway, or so it would seem, is more the kind of public agenda that gets attached to the Republican Party in the way that, Republican elected officials sort of identify with that. And I think that all is implicated in what you're talking about in terms of the fight over, briefly put, 2019 legislative session, more of the same, or, how do we interpret the mandate, in the legislative piece. And I think that does come back in what the public agenda is for Republicans. And that's a little bit about, the slot that West is inserting himself into. And I think that when you say he's playing a role and you mention the Empower Texans thing, I think it's not a coincidence that, if you look behind West, and that's not to say he's a puppet, but it is to say that he has collaborators in all this. There's a political economy to all this that is helping empower Allen West. And he and the people that helped fund those lawsuits against Greg Abbott are some of the same actors that we have seen occupying that space in previous agendas. And I would go back and even think about, there's always this sort of interface or interaction between what the legislative agenda is and what the public discursive agenda is. So, you were mentioning 2015 and 2017. If you go back to those periods that were essentially the years of the Strauss speakership and, the big fights, with groups like Empower Texans, and again, the people that were funding them and their allies within the Republican Party, there were frequently compromises in those agendas. And if you go back and you look at what they got accomplished in those years, they got some of the conservative legislation that they wanted. They didn't get a lot of what they wanted. And during that same period, we did get, again, as we've talked about on here before, we got some big transportation legislation. Mm-hmm. We got water legislation. And so that was the stuff that was not so much part of the public agenda, but was still running through the process at the time. So, when I talk about the agenda, it's sort of like, what is it that defines the Republican Party, for these voters and for the public profiles that the members are having to kind of assert to get reelected. Mm-hmm. And so, how does Allen West play into all that? In some ways he seems, remarkably like more of the same.
Yeah.
And the other piece, and the piece of that, we've done work on. I mean, I think the kind of overall arc that I drop Allen West into right now is kind of this notion of, that we've seen in the polling in a couple of different ways. One of which I've got right in front of me, which is, this idea that we've asked Republicans, do you think that Republican elected officials are conservative enough, too conservative, or not conservative enough? And regularly, about half of Republicans say conservative enough, and exactly half said that in our October poll. And 34% in October said not conservative enough. Now, that not conservative enough faction, as I recall, bubbles around that level, around a third, sometimes a little less.
Right. This is of Republicans.
Among Republicans. And that's just enough to make sure that this is a perpetual problem and not enough to resolve it. Now, the other piece that I would actually then bolt onto that is, to hearken back to the days of old and think about the Tea Party. And, this is all something I think that is, an expression of that same impulse, yet in different historical conditions in the present. We saw a similar thing, with the Tea Party, right? In which active Tea Party identification peaked at what? About 40% or so, maybe low 40s of people that, when offered the option of identifying with the Tea Party or not identifying with the Tea Party, I don't think it ever hit half.
Among Republicans?
Among Republicans.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah.
But what it did do was always bubble in a very similar range, albeit a little bit lower, because and I think that's just branding, frankly. But what we also saw is that when we asked people, do you think this, about the impact the Tea Party was having in their influence, a large number of these Republicans who thought the party was conservative enough still had an approving attitude, more or less, towards the Tea Party, as in some senses, and I'm extrapolating here, but I think it made sense, the guarantors of that conservatism. And so I think that's the problem that we have here, is that there's an inside-outside dimension here in which, the people like Allen West and the Empower Texans factions of the world know that they can strive to exercise a kind of veto power, but they're never really in the driver's seat directly.
Right. Yeah, it's funny you say
that again, that's ideological, but that goes back to the gobbledygook. There's clearly a kind of ideological dimension to that has to do with, the Republican Party is the chosen vehicle of self-identified conservatives.
Right.
But the anti-institutional element does have some kind of limit, particularly when you own state government. And I think that's the limiting factor on these. It's why, to my mind, it's why ultimately the Empower Texans brand and their desire to take over, quote unquote, the party, never quite worked and petered out as the political system got more competitive. But there's still the raw material for an Allen West or a political entrepreneur to work with. And it comes back to where we started. And, if you're Allen West and you're looking around, or you're anybody, it doesn't have to be Allen West, and you see, in terms of, one of your favorite themes, modeled behavior, and you look at Donald Trump and you say, well, this guy can go out there and just kind of say F you to whoever he wants, Democrat, Republican, John McCain, whoever. Well, what's stopping me from protesting outside the governor's mansion? Nothing.
Well,
at least in the short term, but, not everybody is Donald Trump. And I mean, it may very well be that Donald West or Allen West is no Donald Trump. But
and also it's not clear, and it's also not clear, for Allen West what his sort of short, medium, or long-term play is right here, right? I mean, ultimately, he may only be concerned about the short term at the moment. That's interesting. I mean, some of the stuff you said there, I think it was pretty interesting. In particular,
I try.
Yeah, I know you try. Well, I was thinking, I think that's an important point here is that, even in the height of the Tea Party days when the Tea Party was really visible and pushing, even among these sort of non-Tea Party identifying Republicans, there was generally, a sense to the existence of the Tea Party within the Republican Party, and generally the idea that, they're probably doing good. It's probably for the better. And I mean, I'm not sure if I'm willing to go so far as to say, that the guarantor piece of that, but the other side of it too, that I think is sort of important is, you say, the Republicans have no desire to really squash this conflict per se, but it's kind of, I think about, ask the Democrats how, successful it was trying to kick people out of their party, and that was sort of the end of that was the end of the beginning of the end of,
Right.
Democratic control. And so again, the other side, it was the middle, is a little bit different, but ultimately, you can't really scoff at, a third of your party. Right. I mean, I think,
Absolutely.
what I'm curious though about is, what is the, what is allowed Allen West
I
this
just want to
space?
flag. I want to put a pin in a point you made there that I think is really important, because I think that this is where one of those, there's going to be a temptation of people, I think, to misinterpret the history in a way where,
It's the other side.
look, the Democrats will kick people out. The Democrats kick the conservatives out, and look what happened to them. The Republicans are not going to kick the far right of their party out, even though some of them would like to, and the conservatives are going to be more determined to fight for their position in a Republican Party that they see as their natural home. And however much they may be dissatisfied with the centrist or the establishment guys or the ins versus their own outs, they don't have any place to go.
Well, I think that's the key point, and I think that speaks to sort of the limitation of the Allen West approach to all this, which is that ultimately, there's a lot more in-group love than out-group hate most of the time, and in politics that may or may not be true, but ultimately what I really mean by that is it seems like very often people on one side, whether you're on the left or the right, tend to see the divisions of the other side as being much larger than they are. And so if you are, let's say a less overtly conservative Republican, it's really easy for Democrats to say, well, how are you in concert with these guys? How are you a party to this? Without really realizing, look, they probably agree on 90 to 95% of things. And it's really maybe just a matter of intensity or how far one would go on a policy or whatever. It's not about a real disagreement. It's the same thing on the other side. The idea that, less progressive or less overtly liberal Democrats are going to walk away from the Democratic Party because there's an active progressive wing that basically wants to push policies that, they, again, the moderates probably mostly agree with, but to an extent or a level that maybe they are a little bit uncomfortable with. But ultimately, that doesn't mean you're going to start voting Republican, and that's the thing here. But I mean, I do sort of wonder in all of this, what, and maybe this doesn't really matter. I'm just sort of curious. I mean, there are other people who could be taking up this mantle. I mean, I'm thinking about, it's not like Greg Abbott is some moderate. I mean, he's been a very conservative governor. I think he, I think he establishes his conservative credentials regularly and as needed. And I wonder to what extent he's been hamstrung, I think partially by the election, probably almost more so by the pandemic in terms of his ability to kind of focus on, some of this intra-party stuff. And then you've got Dan Patrick, who I think, has really said probably a lot of the same things that Allen West has been saying in, maybe some less aggressive ways, but has certainly, questioned, closing the economy, has certainly, made some aggressive discussion about election. I'm sure he would like to put his finger on the scale in terms of how the House is going to elect a speaker if he could. But he seems to be a little bit more constrained again by being, again, in an elective position, being in the legislature. I mean, is it simply that West is just unconstrained by his position, or is it the fact that, the position is open and so he's taking it? I mean, in some ways it's kind of impressive. I mean, we're talking about him.
Yeah. I mean, like I said at the beginning, look, it's worked.
Right.
For him in the short run. And, you were saying earlier, the short run thing is an interesting question. And, and Dan Patrick is an interesting comparison, in that it wasn't all that long ago that, I think this was sort of a mistake and a misreading at the time, but it's certainly, in the same way, this reminds me of Dan Patrick, on the cover of Texas Monthly Magazine is the most powerful man in Texas.
Right.
And I think it's easy to misunderestimate these things, as the former president would have said, in the short run, and kind of miss the structural dynamic at work here, which is, where we started, the nature of the Republican Party and the fact that, that this is partially a function that the ideological sorting. And I think this is another piece that's different than thinking back to the analogy of the Democrats and their evolution in the late 20th century, as I'm just thinking about it, is that, at that point, the Democratic Party was really a broad coalition party, and it was just too broad. This is not like a problem of broadness, right?
Yeah.
This is a problem of factionalism within a much more ideologically sorted environment inside the party. And so it's by its nature, there are things about it that I think make it a different kind of problem. I mean, it's not completely, but I mean, it's still a coalitional problem. But the coalitional politics play out differently, I mean, and I think in a lot of ways in both parties, the internal politics almost, or not even the politics, but the rhetoric of the parties reflects a reality that's from last generation, which is like, you don't belong here, you're really a liberal. Yeah. When, as you're saying, like, if you really step back and look at it, and this is true on both parties, the people that the progressives in the Democratic Party are calling really conservatives, are not really conservatives, just like, the people that, Alan West is calling traitors and, crypto, he's all about calling people crypto socialists or something. Yeah. I mean, it's not.
Well, but I mean,
I mean, in 1960 or even 1970, you could legitimately stand in the Democratic Party and go, hey, you know what? You're a conservative. You don't belong here. And it was sort of objectively pretty arguable, pretty true. Right. I mean, it was a strong argument in a lot of cases. That argument is doesn't quite have that legitimacy now that it does, because we've gone through a generation of sorting.
Yeah, and I wonder, well, I mean, it's interesting because, I think one of the things that I'm having difficulty settling on here is the extent to which, what we're witnessing right now is a reflection of, how sorted and how fixed the ideological points of sort of the parties and their partisans are, or the fact that it's completely unfixed. And I don't know which the answer is. I mean, on the one hand, I think there's evidence to say it's fixed. I think that's part of the whole, this is more of the same. We're seeing the same conflict manifest itself that we've seen before under different names, different actors, whatever. I mean, there's part of me that's not ready to dismiss the argument, although I'm not sure I believe it, which is to say, after 4 years of Donald Trump at the helm of the Republican Party, which really, again, not a traditionally conservative Republican, not a traditionally conservative president or president period. And now we're in this sort of the beginning of the after period. And, it seems to me that there is space for entrepreneurs to come out, political entrepreneurs to come out and say, no, this is what this means. This is what it means to be a Republican in Texas.
I guess what I would do is the way that, just using the language you use there, I mean, I would say that the points aren't fixed, but the bounds are more fixed. Mm-hmm. And, so that may be like irrelevant for and so,
right.
Where the point is might be irrelevant for the conflict within the bounds. It's just that the bounds have become more clear.
Yeah.
And, and then, it's an interesting hypothesis whether, that engenders more or less intense conflict. I mean, in and of itself, it's probably not determinative. But I think that is kind of the situation we're in, and that the bounds are more clear. And, and it's a reasonable hypothesis to say that does that make, and there's work on that, I guess, but what is that, how does that affect the dynamics inside the party in terms of gravity? And I think, the other thing that has to be remembered here, that it gets lost too much. And I certainly forget to pay attention to it, frankly, because I pay so much attention to public opinion now. But is that, there's a very intense elite level of politics going on here. Alan West would not be as successful as he was did he not, and by successful, I mean at gaining attention, right. Did he not have powerful, well-funded allies? Now, I'm not saying that that's the only driver. Alan West clearly has been able to understand media, and there are things about this that have enabled his success. But the fact that there are people with, practically, at least, practically speaking in a political sense, infinite amount of resources to put into the kind of stuff that he, the kind of positions that he's taken in his entrepreneurialism, he has sponsors.
Yeah, and that's really his main weapon, right? I mean, ultimately, what I'm thinking as you're talking about that, it is, it's interesting to see how this is going to play out in the medium to long term. I mean,
Right.
I'm curious in all this stuff, but I'm super curious for this just because, at some point, generally as the party chairman, you're not really in a super powerful position. You're not
Right.
the governor, you're not the lieutenant governor, you're not even the chairman of a major committee in the Texas House, right? And so eventually these stories are going to get old for reporters, the idea of him picking fights with people. I mean, I think they'll still cover it because it's still fun. But then you're right though. Then what are his weapons, right? I mean, again, he doesn't have actual levers of power, but what he does have, as you're pointing out, is he has resources, and he has the same resources
Right.
that the same people who've been, exercising these conflicts have been using for the last 10 years.
And and those forces have been relatively creative in their ability to find vehicles for their desire to push their own agendas, their own profiles, and to try to impact the process.
Right.
And
so
we will find out in, I would say 2 months, but really probably in about 3 months, just how successful Allen West can be in making himself seem relevant in the midst of a legislative session. A lot of that is going to be about how reporters, what they do. I mean, his agency in this, Allen West has agency. Don't want to take that away, but also, how the press, responds to him, and whether he continues to generate coverage, in a different news environment. We'll see. I mean,
yeah, let me say one thing. I mean, I think we should wrap up soon here, probably. But, that raises a really good point. It's sort of, I'm thinking about this in the summation of this conversation. There's sort of like, an Allen West more of the same kind of argument here. But it is interesting in the sense that, if it is more of the same, eventually, if Allen West kind of continues down this path, so let's say we get into the legislative session and he's, trying to be real active about what the legislature should and shouldn't do. And let's even say probably even how they should go about doing it or not doing it, as he's already kind of getting involved in. And ultimately, those legislators, for the most part, are going to ignore him. But it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, again, because of the nature of the conflict, it's going to be hard for reporters not to write about it. And look, I mean, hey, I'm reading about it. It's fun. I mean, it's interesting. It's fun. There's again, these are the sorts of biases we talk about. Like, again, if you sort of see what people who study the media talk about, the real bias in the media is not partisan. It's actually just a bias towards conflict, towards things that are sexy, towards stuff like this, honestly. But the question becomes, the more he tries to kind of light a bag filled with poo on the doorstep of the legislature, to no effect, which is basically, kind of what the story has been. And not because the Republican Party doesn't listen to conservatives, it's because they do, and they've continued to, that eventually does this kind of just peter out? Or, does he have a way to kind of keep the momentum of this going once there's a lot of other stuff to talk about? And and it'll be interesting to see, because ultimately I don't think that, I think from an objective and just, it's not objective. I mean, just from an informed subjective standpoint, there's no reason for this story to go on that long. Having said that, West is clearly, a pretty talented political entrepreneur. And I think the real question that everyone is also talking about is, what is the goal of this? Is it to, make sure the Republican Party of Texas is pure, or is it to advance Allen West to some other job? And
I would say the key question right now is he'll have made him, he's made himself radioactive in the governor's office.
Right.
He's made himself radioactive with the incoming speaker.
Right.
How often is Allen West talking to Dan Patrick or Dan Patrick's team, shall we call them?
Right.
And will Allen West be useful in the House Senate politics, in the politics of the big three going forward? Will he be useful to Dan Patrick?
Yeah,
that would be my big question. So you asked, what do I make of this? That's my question for the moment.
That's perfect.
How much is Allen West talking to people that talk directly to the lieutenant governor, to the lieutenant governor himself, and how useful will he be to him going forward? Because if he can be useful to him, then it's fine. But that also speaks to where Allen West's ambitions, and as you say, I think the assumption is he wants to run for office. How consonant or dissonant is that with the lieutenant governor's plans would be my question.
Fair enough.
And with that, that'll be it for this week's highly speculative version of the Second Reading podcast.
We had data. We had some data.
There was some data in this. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to, as always, our excellent technical crew in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin, the Liberal Arts Development Studio. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.